We are going to continue our conference now with debate. We have with us four dear friends of this institution. Matthew Taylor, former fellow, also Center, Associate Professor of Political Science at American University. If you are a former fellow, you are forever a fellow at the Wilson Center. And Matthew has the he's in a unique position because he was in Brazil for many years. He has an association with the University of São Paulo. And I always tease him saying that he thinks he is American. He's spreading this. It's not necessarily so. Fernando Limonge, at the Center, professor at the University of São Paulo, Political Science Department, one of the foremost experts in political systems in Brazil, and one of the people that greeted Matthew when he was at USP. Fernando is now a global fellow at this, the Brazil Institute, so he is conducting a series of research, and he is a non-resident fellow, but he comes and goes because he continues to have his responsibilities in São Paulo at the university and at SEBRAP, a very important think tank created in '69 after the military expelled 44 professors from the universities in São Paulo, especially the University of São Paulo, among them Professor Fernando Henrique Cardoso. We have with us Professor Oscar Vilhena, Dean of the Law School at Fundação Getúlio Vargas in São Paulo, also a global scholar here with the Brazil Institute, and in a double appointment here at the Washington College of Law, where our dear friend and partner, Judge Peter Massetti, conducted an important program, judicial initiative in Brazil and the United States. So also Oscar is here doing research and writing a book on the 30 years of the 1988 Constitution. Last but not least, Mauricio Moura from Ideia Inteligência has been with us many, many times and has agreed to come back today to start the conversation by presenting a survey that he prepared and ran especially for this on crucial choices facing the country, some important opinions in Brazil about what is the political scenario, how people see politicians, how they see the institutions. Well, what are the questions that will frame their choices come October? With that, I would like to offer the floor to Mauricio Moura to start us off. Thank you, Mauricio.
Good morning. Thank you, Paulo. Thank you. Hi, Matthew, Oscar, Fernando. Thanks for staying. I imagine you guys will have a meeting with Paul Ryan at this moment. So, as Paulo has mentioned, we did run a survey this couple weeks of 2018. I want to share some numbers with you. Today, the survey was run basically last week. We did interview 5,000 people in Brazil from different regions, from the north, the northeast, center west, southeast, of course, the south. So we did run the survey in 37 cities, to be exact on the number. So let's go. Do you believe that the National Congress will agree on and pass a pension system reform in 2018? The majority, 55%, don't agree, and they are not as optimistic as the Speaker of the House, but he was mentioned today that it's not an easy topic, especially in the election year. So that's what people feel, especially it's going to be very hard for the government to do it. In your personal opinion, which reform would be the most important to be approved by the National Congress this year? I just took it out, the labor reform that the Congress approved last year, and people in Brazil, they have the knowledge that the labor reform was approved. but the people claim that they want to see the political reform. They didn't know that they did something on political reform last year, but this is when, every time I run, what kind of reform do you want? People want the political reform. Of course, they don't know, mostly they don't have a clue what kind of political reform, but they feel that this is necessary. About the following sentence, the current National Congress has been working for the Brazilian people interest above all. Do you? Well, 73% don't agree. There is a clear sensation that the people in Congress, they are much more concerned about their own issues than the Brazilian issues overall. The other sentence, I feel that the current National Congress really represents the Brazilian people. Of course, this is not a Brazilian issue. The people don't feel represented. It's kind of a global theme, and maybe the scholars, they know better than me. But what was interesting for me was the kind of level. 84% don't think that the Congress represents themselves. So it's a big PR issue for the Congress on that. But this is the one side. The other side is that, do you recall or do you remember who did you vote for National Congressman or Congresswoman in 2014? So almost 80% don't remember. So it's very hard when you don't remember who you voted for, if this is going to be representing you. And so it's interesting because when you run these surveys, a lot of people remember to had voted for Tiririca, the clown. I don't know if you guys have heard about that, but almost they don't remember, of course, the consequence of this. And only for those 21% that did remember or do remember, do you follow your federal congressman, congresswoman votes in the House? So do you follow what's going on with people that you voted? For those people that do remember, only 15% actually follow their representatives. So it's a very easy life to be a congressman and congresswoman in Brazil. So, and in 2018, I think this is one of the good things, and that was an open question. So we didn't give people any choice. Was what is the key element, attribute that a congressman, congresswoman candidate must have to have your vote in this year? And the number one was, to be honest, honesty, 38%. So this is not anymore an assumption. This is some kind of a great attribute to be. The second one is transparency. Third one, out of Lava Jato scandal. That's going to be a difficult one for the Congress. And there's another one, to be outsider. And when I say outsider, people related with people with no connections with politics, which means they are most likely to be honest. And then other attributes like experience, proposals, understand my problems, represent the poor, smart, hard worker. So I've never seen, since I started working on this, the level of demand for honesty in the candidates as I see right now. And I think this is one of the legacies of Lava Jato. People are going to be focused a lot on that. And one of the arguments to be done, to be worked on the campaign, will be to show that you are honest candidates. And another question, do you believe that the future elected National Congress, so the Congress that will emerge from the election, will be better, the same, worse, if compared to the current one? So, only 35% are optimistic that they're saying it's going to be better. But when you say it's going to be worse and the same, it's more than half the majority. So there is it's interesting that people don't feel confident about their own vote on that chance of changing the Congress. And in the beginning of the year, this is the third time that I run those questions. So I did run in 2016, beginning of 2017, and right now. And thinking about the Brazilian economy, 2018 will be better, the same, worse, if compared to last year. And this, for the first time, after the third year working on this question, people are confident that 2018 will be better than 2017. This is the first time that I see a positive answer on that one. And but there's one question that's very consistent. Every year, people think that things can get worse. And when we talk about politics, so every year, the third year in a row, most of the people, 80%, think that the politics in 2018 will be worse than in 17. And they don't feel much hope that we're going to have meaningful discussions about Brazilian issues in the election. So that's one of the bad things that came up on that survey. But another consistent answer that Brazilians do give is that every year that I ask, how about your personal life? The politics is bad, the economy is not good, but your personal life's always going to be better. So this is amazing in terms of everything is not going to work except for your personal life. So this is one of the conclusions. Thank you.
Well, now you understand why optimism is our middle name. So regardless of the reality, we are going to be better personally. If you have questions for Mauricio, be gentle. He's a, brand new father. He's the dad of Maia, who was born recently. So be gentle with your questions.
Lack of sleep?
Lack of sleep is a major problem factor here. Monica.
Just a clarifying question. So the honesty, the 38% who want honesty, the honesty is really not being corrupt.
That's
the definition of honesty.
yeah.
Okay.
Don't steal public money. That's it.
Okay. Peter.
How do you,
Hold on a second, sir, so that the people watching online can hear your question.
thank you. How do you reconcile the fact that such a large number want anti-corruption, honesty, transparency? At the same time, Lula consistently comes out the highest in the polls. Isn't there a contradiction fundamental there?
Yeah, there are two issues. First one, some people do consider that Lula is not guilty. So there is part of his voters that see that he's being prosecuted by the system, by the rich, by the elite. So there's and another people that do consider that he's guilty. They claim that every politician is corrupt. But when Lula was in power, my life was better. So they're very rational on that sense. So there is that combination. But Lula is a unique figure in that sense.
Okay. More questions for Mauricio? If not, we'll move to the panel. And I think that's what we are going to do. We will start with Fernando, then Oscar, then Matthew. They are going to have 15 minutes each. I think the first two have PowerPoints. You tell me where do you want to be, if you wanted to be where you are, if you wanted to come to the podium. You stay there? Okay. So we'll start then with Professor Fernando Libonge. And here we go. Thank you very much.
Let's see if I can move this. How does this work?
You just need to press this one.
Huh? This? Okay. Good morning. Thank you, everybody, for Paulo and all the members of the table. I'll try to be precise and to expose some data and some information so that we can think about the coming election. I will focus on the presidential election only. So Tom Jobim, the famous composer, once said that Brazil is not for amateurs. He was saying, just don't try to understand this country. You can't figure this out. More so when it comes to politics. No one understands Brazilian politics. Don't even try. Well, true, the first image one has is of something beyond reason, chaotic, but not a simple chaos, but a second-order degree chaos, beyond reason, unpredictable. How is one to understand a country that has more than 40 registered parties, almost all of them with at least one seat in the lower house. We like word titles. Everything in the country is the greatest in the world. Maracanã, you know, is the largest soccer stadium in the world. The country has the most fragmented lower house in the world. Lava Jato is the biggest scandal, corruption scandal, ever observed. And we think like a boat. Records are there to be broken. The fragmentation, for instance, keeps increasing. A new record is registered at each new election. It's in here, right? So, and I have to move this thing also. Very complex to me. As we look at elections, the first image one gets is of a complete confusion. What we have in this slide are the alliance for the president in the first row, the party coalitions, coligações that the parties made to run for presidential. Dilma's alliance includes all these red parties, parties that are painted as red. Aécio's alliance, the PSDB alliance, appears in blue, and the Campos Marina bloc are the yellow boxes. And there are also these 8 isolated candidacies. Below, we have the a sample. I could not put the 27 governorship elections in the same slide. So I put a sample of them. So you see that all the 30-something parties take part in each election, but they combine in a very specific way. There is no correspondence between the presidential election and the gubernatorial election. There is no match among alliances. Parties are extremely promiscuous on their choice of partners. In a sense, Brazil or Brazilian parties seems to have got stuck in the 70s. They all want to experiment new partners. So if one were to stop here, there would be not much to say.
Use their move.
Huh? No. It's okay. There would be no much to say about the upcoming elections, other than they say they cannot be predicted. And the president of the House said that, right? There is always movement, no pattern, no order, no stability. Anything can happen. Yet down there below the Rio Grande, water evaporates at 100 degrees Celsius and freezes at 0. And we use Celsius and not Fahrenheit. And we use meters and kilometers instead of inches and miles. It may be difficult to translate, but there are formulas. Besides, law, just like the gravity law, do work as well in Brazil. And so it does what perhaps is one of the unique laws in political science, the Diverger law. Simply stated, this law says the following. The larger the cost of entry for one election, the smaller the number of candidacies. We never had 38 candidates for president, and we will never will. So let us go back to the first row of the slide. What we have in here are 2 to 3 viable candidacies. Dilma, Aécio, and Campos Marina. The other ones, they do not count. Never did, never will. So we can dispose of them, send them away. So all we have is this, 3 running viable candidacies. Nothing else. These are the candidacies that interest us. The 3 that were supported by alliances. These 2 facts, as I will show, are related. These are the viable candidacies because they count with the support of alliances or coligações. And they count with the support of big alliances because they are viable to begin with. So let us look at the outcome of all presidential elections since the redemocratization in Brazil. We have already 7 elections, and to look and to draw lessons from. Let us look at the distribution of votes. Start looking at the fourth column, the last column, at the percentage of the votes that the fourth best placed candidate got. Other than 1989, the first election, and the special election of 2002, they have done very bad. They have had very little support, almost 0% of the votes. And if you look at the third ranked candidate, you will see that the third did not do so well either. Compare the third with the second best placed candidate. Most of the time, this candidate, the third one, had no real chance. It was not a real threat to the second place. So what we have in the end is a two-candidate race. It has been so, it will continue to be so. To sum up, most voters converge to the first and the second placed candidacies. This thing. Exactly what the divergent law says will happen. Okay, this is the final outcome after all the water has gone under the bridge. But as this next slide shows, most of this outcome antecedes voters' intervention. It is the product of parties' strategies. What we see in here are the party alliances in all 7 previous presidential elections. We can clearly see that in 1994 election, the second election after redemocratization, 2 big blocks were formed, one commanded by PSDB and another under the leadership of PT. They are not that unstable through time, at least if we consider the main allies, like them with PSDB and PSB with PT. We see that the third force is not constant, which means that the party that leads the attempt to break the duopoly changes from election to election. But since PT conquered the presidency in 2002, this third force tends to be composed by parties that split from the PT alliance. Note the special situation of PMDB. Moved around, sometimes with one group, sometimes with the other group, but never had a viable candidate. Therefore, the big question for 2018, the coming election, is, will the duopoly resist? Will a third force or alternative constitute itself? Moreover, and more importantly, are we able to know who, parties and candidacies, will command these 2 big alliances? More specifically, will PT and PSDB be able to hold their positions? There are good reasons to answer this question negatively. Both were hit by the Lava Jato and the impeachment crisis. And positively, they already have good candidates, very strong candidacies put on already. So I will return to this question and considerations later on. Let me just conclude, not moving this too fast, this part saying that we had good reasons to expect that a scenario like the ones observed in the past will re-emerge. The identities may change, but not the structure. It's too costly to run a presidential campaign. The cost I'm referring to goes beyond money. Obviously, it includes money. But to begin with, you need allies, and you need allies running for governorship in the main states, such as São Paulo, Minas Gerais, and Bahia, etc. If you don't have them, you don't put a strong candidacy. Electoral competition, as Americans know very well, is primarily a competition for resources. One may only be considered a viable candidate if one is able to assemble or to attract resources that indicated that he will be able to put together a viable and enduring campaign. But in Brazil, differently from the US, potential candidates do not run after donors. They can defer that for a later stage in the competition. The first phase is dominated by party leaders, since they control the key resources. The most important of them being the access to free time on radio and TV to communicate with voters. Brazilian legislation is unique. Parties receive an enormous amount of free time on the media. For 45 days, this is the first time that is 45 days, it's always 2 months, 60 days, now it will be 45 days. Before the elections, parties divide among themselves something like 2 hours of nationally broadcasted time to make their campaigns. They do not buy and cannot privately buy time on radio or TV. They get all for free from the state. So Brazil has the most extreme mode of public campaign finance in the world. No other country has such a thing. This is why parties' alliances are indicators of strength. A viable candidature is one supported by several parties for a very specific and clear reason. Each party controls a fraction of the most valuable resource to structure a presidential campaign: time of radio and TV. Alliances sum up the time each individual party receives. That's why it's so important to make a big an alliance. You get more time on radio and TV. So, the statement that you're having here, or an analysis of the strategy of PSDB presidential candidate, summarizes what I am trying to pinpoint. Alckmin is searching for allies. He's trying to form his coligação, his alliance, the formal alliance that he has to register in the Tribunal Eleitoral. The ones that I have showed in the previous slides. And the reason is clearly stated. To increase the fraction of free access to radio and TV, he will have to run his campaign. You see, this is a news at the newspaper, O Estado de São Paulo. He's clearly stating what he's after. He needs to buy or to obtain time to structure his campaign. So Brazilian electoral campaigns for executive offices, president and governorship, are mainly run through the free and large access parties have to radio and TV. For 45 days, every other day, candidates will have access to the national broadcasting. Is a lot of time to campaign. A candidate cannot buy time on TV. Initially, their fraction of the total time is proportional to the seats the party controls in the lower house. But allies do transfer their time to their partners. Alckmin, so, is calculating how much time he needs to be a viable candidate. Say that he is successfully to attract PR and PSB, as he's saying there, and he gets the 4 minutes he wants. So what will do Rodrigo Maia after that? Maia, if he wants to run, if he wants to be a viable candidate, he will have to do the same. So will Lula, and so will Bolsonaro, if Bolsonaro gets this idea. Ideas are not his thing. But note that the starting point from which any one of these pre-candidates departs is not the same. PMDB, PSDB, and PT have the largest fraction. Without their support, you cannot put together a campaign. So they have clear advantage. Bolsonaro choose a party that has only how many seconds in the TV? Almost 0. To conclude this point, from now up to July, and you saw that Rodrigo Maia said, in June, July, everything will be decided. Why? Because of the conventions, party conventions. So this, from now up to July, is, so to speak, the can't say this word. So they are trying to match. The parties are flirtation with each other, trying to attract partners. So it's not like the US primaries. It's not open. It's not to the public. Voters do not participate in this process. This is party business. Strictly party business. Voters and donors do not take part in this process. The alliances or deals, party leaders strike using the two resources they monopolize: the decision to launch a candidacy or to join an alliance, and the time they have for propaganda electoral. In this sense, note that one cannot say that Brazilian parties are weak. Brazilian parties are really strong creatures. But what about all this fuss about Brazilian elections being the most expensive in the world? True, parties have expended a lot of money on campaigns. This is too fancy, right? I have to press this thing too many. Look at that.
Super cool.
Uh-huh. My daughter did that to me. So, in fact, this is true. Expenditures have been growing. This is wrong. It's not billions of reais, but 100 millions of reais. Too much money, you get confused. But note that these expenditures are not fixed. The absolute value is not as important as the marginal advantage over your adversary. As Jorge Avelino, the source of this data, explains, parties are engaged in an arm race type of competition. If you have 100, I have to have 200. And since you got 2, I will fight to get 300 and so on and so forth. So parties keep on competing and they get much more money than they actually need. Besides, money is not that important. It is important, but not that important. The more important is to get time on TV. And then you need money to fill the time of TV that you have. But what is important is your advantage over your adversary. So let's move on. So just to conclude, let me show the structure and the stability of these elections from another angle. Look at this time to electoral behavior or outcomes. What this graph shows, and there is no graph in there, so this is the graph. So what we have here is presidential elections from 2010 and 2014 by education at the ballot level. So I have the data for each sessão eleitoral, each ballot, every other 300 voters. And I know how they voted, and I know the educational level of the voters that vote in this section, because I have the data from the TSE. So what I did, I ordered all the sessões, all the ballots, from the lowest educated ones to the most educated ones, and created 100 groups of elections, right? So I divided up by centiles. Thanks. So what do we see here? No, not in here that I have to So this is the vote for Dilma in 2010. So the lowest educated people tend to vote more for PT, and as you move for the more educated sessões eleitorais or the ballots, the vote for PT goes decreasing, right? So these first sessões here at the left are the ones in which most voters are illiterate. Then you keep moving, and the sessões getting more educated. When you get to the end, to the last group, everybody has undergrad degree at least. So we move from the less educated people to the most educated people, from the poorest people to the richest people. So you see that PT vote goes down. So if this is a two-party race, it follows automatically that the PSDB vote has to go the opposite way, right? So the PSDB strength is among the richest people, the most educated people. As the sessões eleitorais get more educated, the vote for PSDB increases. This is 2010. This is 2014. So you see that the distribution of votes for PT in 2010 and 2014 is about the same. There's a little difference. PT increases its votes with the poor a little bit in the extreme illiterate group and loses votes for all the other groups. But the curve is about the same, right? So you can predict the 2014 election from the 2010 election. And I have data to 2006, to 2002, to all Brazilian elections in this same fashion. From 2006 to 2014 is the same pattern. And of course, this is PSDB. I didn't put Marina in here because it would be too, the graph would not be so neat, but Marina is flat. Flat. Little increase in the end with the richest people. And so this is more or less what we have been observing in the last elections. Very stable political behavior. So this is very predictable. And this is stable since 2006. So conclusions. I have no conclusions. No time left. I have to finish in here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll hear now from Oscar Villena, who I believe will concentrate, well, an introduction, but then there is a major event that will affect the electoral outlook this year, which is this decision by the Court of Appeals in Porto Alegre a week from today regarding the guilty verdict returned against President Lula by Judge Sergio Moro in July of last year. And obviously, depending on this decision, his capacity, the possibility of he would run again could be questioned. With that, I would like to give the floor to Professor Oscar Villena.
Good morning, everyone. I think after Mauricio's and Fernando's PowerPoint, my could be classified as another thing. And I will blame with my daughter. Now I understand what I have to do. Here, I hate PowerPoints, and I hate PowerPoints with many words, and this is exactly what you're going to see. However, since I know that many of you are not as familiar as perhaps members of the table with the legal structure in Brazil, I put here just for those who wants to to get a grasp on the legislation. So that's why we have too many words. So, as Paulo said, there is an issue, a major event that can impose perhaps some new formulations to Fernando. What happens if Lula cannot run? And as you know, Lula was convicted, and there will be a panel that is analyzing this appeal that he posed next week, and this will have consequences. So this is what I will talk about. Just for to have a okay. So Article 14 of the Constitution transfers to the legislator the responsibility to set ineligibility criteria. And this was made in 1990 by Lei Complementary Law 64 from 1990. And this was renewed in 2010 after the Mensalão. So with the Mensalão, there was this enormous movement to control corruption, so the eligibility law became tougher. What exactly is the tough part of this legislation? Is one article which says that a person who is convicted of a crime and his appeal is confirmed by a second instance court will immediately suffer the effects of this conviction. What is the change? The change is that before 2010, a person should be convicted at the last level. So there could not be have any other appeal. And after 2010, a second instance conviction is sufficient to block a person to exercise its political rights and obviously to become a candidate. So this is the issue that Lula will face when in several of his appeals. Okay, so is the last part of the red letters is what is important. A decision that delivered by a collegial judicial instance. That is a second instance court. Okay, so President Lula was convicted in 2017. There is other processes going on. There is one that is happening today, one of the audiences, in the case of his small farm, the sítio, which is a much more complicated case than this one because it happens the beginning of the construction in the sítio was when he was a president. So it's a more complicated case for him. And he appealed of this decision by Judge Moro, and the Fourth Region Federal Court will review this case January 24. Okay, so if the decision is that he's not guilty, then he's free to go and free to run. From what we know until this moment, there is one of the votes that is already public and is against him, and perhaps we will have at least one more vote. It's a panel of 3 judges. So probably he will have the conviction confirmed on the 24th by 2-1 or by 3-0. There is a little difference. If it's 2-1, you have some internal appeals to the court itself. So this will slow down a little bit the process. And even though in the end it doesn't matter in terms of legal, from the legal aspects, from the agenda of the election is very important, because if he gained time, so it will become easier for him to register himself and to block his candidacy. Okay, so there is a difference if he's convicted by 2-1 or if he's convicted by 3-0. Small distinction in terms of time. Well, if he is convicted in this new legislation that was approved in 2010, there is Article 26C, which allows these candidates to ask for an immediate injunction to suspend the consequences of the criminal conviction. So it's an electoral process. You will make this appeal through the electoral courts, asking the court to disregard not the criminal, he can go to prison, etc., but to disregard the part of the sentence that has as a consequence the limitation that he exercised his political rights and that he becomes a candidate. So there is, to change this to not legal words, there is a fast track. So if he's convicted in 24 of January, he has a fast track to ask for immediate suspension of the consequences of the sentences. Just for you to have an idea, there are 147 mayors in Brazil at this moment that in the last election were elected even though they have been convicted in a second instance trial, but they were beneficiary of this emergence injunction. Okay? So it is a credible injunction that can be used by Lula. Obviously that his campaign will think about it, because if they ask this to the court and receive a no immediately, so his chances will be blocked. And he can use this in a limit time, but probably he will wait a little bit to understand the political system, how the election flow, to use or not to use this mechanism, okay? So the second hypothesis is that after buying all the time that he can with the other appeals, the internal appeals that I said, and if he uses this suspension of eligibility appeal and it's not granted, so what happens then? Registration of the candidacies, the deadline is August 15. So all the political parties will go to the TSE and will bring their chapas, their list of candidates, and President Lula probably will be there. So after this registration, the Superior Electoral Court, in the case of Lula, will have 5 days to public the list. And after these 5 days, there will be also some time for those who want to challenge the list for some reason. So Lula will be registered, and then there will be the publication of the list, and then there will be open time for those who want to challenge other political parties and the Procuradoria Geral da República, the prosecutor office, the Federal Prosecutorial Office. And they probably will claim that he cannot be a candidate because he was convicted in the second instance trial on criminal charges, crimes against the public administration, corruption and money laundering in his case. So I asked some colleagues, I'm not an expert in electoral law, but I asked some colleagues to say how long this will take for the decision. And the best guess is 26 days minimum. Why we have a minimum? Because the defense wants to explore the maximum time that the defense has, because it has to postpone the decision. And even though the courts wanted to resolve this, I'm guessing, as fast as they cannot decrease the time less than 26 days. So from August 15, you count at least 26 days so that the TSE has a decision about if Lula can or cannot be a candidate. During this time, he can act as a candidate. He can do all acts as a candidate. Okay? So, we are talking about September. We are talking about the first week or the beginning of the second week of September. The best, the minimum. It can be more than that. Okay? And there is another interesting aspect. Any party can change its candidate 20 days until 20 days before election. Okay? So we are arriving here to a situation that probably Lula will be on the ballot, and we will have no decision until then. Okay? So if after 26 days, PT doesn't have success on all his appeals at the electoral court, they don't allow their registration. So what they can do, they can appeal to the Supreme Court, okay? So time in the Supreme Court is something completely out of any legal control. They control their own agenda. How things move here. After he filed an appeal, this appeal is distributed to one of the justices, electronically distributed to one of the justices. All the justices have the power to provide individually immediate injunctions. So, if the appeal got into the hands of a judge that understands that Lula cannot run, probably he will not provide the appeal, not
Distribute it?
no, not accept the appeal. Okay? If someone has a better word, please help me. Will not grant the appeal. Okay? If the appeal got in the hands of a justice that is sympathetic to Lula's claim, he can grant the appeal. And then he's legally in the ballot. Okay? However, these decisions normally are submitted to the plenary of the court. It depends on how the justice, who is the rapporteur of the case, sent to the president of the court, and the president of the court put in the agenda. Several of the justices in Brazil, it's very, Fernando said that things a little bit different there, even though some laws apply generally, but judges talk a lot, and they talk publicly, and they also talk in off for journalists. So we have several informations of the justice that they want to solve this before the election, which is a very nice thing that they want to solve this before the election, okay? So it will be at the Supreme Court. Has the Supreme Court already deliberated about the issue, and what is the issue, the legal issue before the Supreme Court on Lula, in Lula case? The legal issue is it constitutional that a law extract consequences for a criminal sentence in first and second instance? Is this constitution? Why is constitution? Because in the Constitution we have a clause that says that no one should be found guilty, so it's the presumption of innocence, a clause, before a final trial. So Lula is not in the final trial. There is a final trial. Okay? So is it constitution, this electoral law, that extract consequences from a criminal conviction, even though this criminal conviction is not the last instance conviction? Okay. So the Supreme Court already faced this issue. Okay, in 2012, there was a constitutional action against the Ficha Limpa law, specifically on this issue. And the majority of the court understood that the presumption of innocence, written in the Constitution, and literally is written criminal presumption of innocence, applies only to criminal issues. So we can extract consequences from a criminal conviction for other areas of law. And electoral law is legitimate to establish the eligibility criteria, because Article 19 of the Constitution transferred to Congress this competence. So the majority would understand that obviously the legislation is okay. So if Lula was convicted by a second instance trial, he cannot run for president. So this was the majority formed in 2012. Just for you to have an idea of how the court was composed, so the majority on the left, we have the 7 justices. 2 of them retired. Okay? And on the right, you have the minority, the dissenting votes. 1 of them retired. And we have 3 new justices. So, in fact, it's a different court that will analyze, and precedents are not as strong as they are by the little court, white court up there in the mountains. So it's a little different. They feel very tranquil to challenge their own jurisdiction, their own jurisprudence, okay? So there is a second precedent, which is reasonably important to understand this case, which is an habeas corpus decided in 2016 regarding the issue specifically of criminal law. Can I extract consequences of a criminal conviction and send people to jail before his final appeal is analyzed by a final court? So those who are journalists have to take care with what I say. In Portuguese will be, a sentença judicial pode ser executada. The judicial sentence can be executed, but execution has nothing to do with death penalty. It is implemented. The sentence could be implemented after second instance. So here, you would have no problem with that. People are sent to jail first instance sentence. The pattern established by human rights treaties is second tier. So after a second tier, you can be, the sentence could be implemented. The Brazilian Constitution says final sentence. So there is a huge debate. The Supreme Court until 2009 has one position. It shifted in 2010, and then it returned in 2016 to a more conservative position in the sense that people can be sent to jail after second instance. And these are the majority of the court. So why I'm putting this here? Because I'm trying to guess how Justice Luiz Roberto Barroso will vote, because he was not there. So he voted saying that even in criminal cases, you can execute the sentence. So in the area of electoral law, probably he will vote in the same way, okay? Alexandre Moraes has written that you can execute in the second tier also. So probably he will come to this majority, but we don't know, okay? My guess about what will happen if the case arrived at the Supreme Court. If we put the two cases that are parallel, we have over majority saying that the sentence can be implemented in the second tier, so Lula will not be able to run. However, we have two justices who are, I would say politely, very oriented by political flags. And they can shift without any damage to their reputations because they, they have a problem. They don't understand the concept very well. They don't care about the concept very well. So Gilmar Ferreira Mendes, who was a very liberal judge in criminal cases and was against the execution of the sentence in second tier, it's very against Lula. So it will be not a surprise if he shifts position. I don't know if he will do that. And Ricardo Lewandowski, who was very tough on the first case on the electoral execution of the second tier sentence, it's very pro-Lula, so he can move also. So my, Fernando was wiser, always wiser than me, say, well, I have no conclusion. I would say the majority of the court, I would take the risk to say, the majority of the court probably will be against Lula registration if the criminal case is decided on the 24th, okay? We don't know if they will have time to analyze this, and if they don't have time, that means that he will run. If by postponing the court didn't arrive to a decision, he will probably run. And then there will be another problem that we will not discuss at this moment here, what we're going to do if he's convicted and elected. So this will be another problem. However, since these individual injunctions are extremely efficient and used in Brazil, vastly used by Supreme Court justices, and you have a group of justices that, by their precedents, would grant these injunctions thoughtfully. Celso de Mello, they will grant because they believe that a person cannot be restricted in their rights just after a second-tier decision. So probably will grant an injunction. And if Gilmar Ferreira Mendes is coherent with his precedents, he will do the same. And Ricardo Lewandowski will probably do the same. So we have a good chance that by injunction he can be in the ballot in the election. So, but this is my irresponsibility of not following your precedent of no conclusion.
Well, I always tell you, you learn new things when you come to events, discussions that we host here at the Wilson Center. Now it's up to Matthew Taylor to figure this out and tell us his conclusion. Matthew, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, my conclusion is I need to teach my children PowerPoint. There's going to be a new regime at home when I get home tonight. Last year at an event here, I said that I thought this was going to be the most wide open election in the history of the democratic regime in Brazil, and I think today we've proved that beyond a doubt. I think Rodrigo Maia said it best when he said the election is a century away. The next 8 months are going to be very, very painful for people like us who analyze Brazil for a living, as candidates jockey for position, as parties jockey for alliances, and as Fernando pointed out, for airtime that's allocated on the basis of those alliances. There are some sort of road posts along the way that I think are going to help us to make sense of the uncertainty. The first one, which Oscar mentioned, was the decision by the appeals court on the 24th. The second major one is the first week of April, when sitting executives need to step down if they're running for office, whether it's at the state or the federal level. It's also, and I think that this is a bit of a long shot, but it's also the date when outsiders would need to start registering to be members of parties. And so I think it's a date that a lot of people are going to be looking at. It's also going to be a date where several potential candidates are going to gauge their potential as victorious candidates. So, for example, has Alckmin, the governor of Sao Paulo, cleared 10%? Has Rodrigo Maia gotten past what he mentioned today, his 1%? So I think that will have some clearing effect. And then August is when everything really goes haywire with the beginning of advertising and the beginning of TV time. So I have to be quite honest with you. I don't really know how all this is going to play out, but I'm thinking about 5 different questions that I think we should all be focused on that will shape the way this election is likely to play. The first one, Oscar just really did a great job of laying out, which is what happens to Lula? What kind of certainty is there about Lula's removal as a candidate or not? And I actually think that there are kind of 2 nightmare scenarios, and I mean them as nightmare scenarios not because of a sense of partisan opposition or partisan affiliation with Lula, but mainly because I think they're not very good for Brazilian democracy. The first is that Lula is removed by the court, and somehow that's upheld all the way up the court system, and then you have a very strong null vote, a null and void vote that's cast by Lula supporters. I think that would be extraordinarily damaging to Brazilian democracy. The second, though, is something that I think is more likely, and after hearing Oscar, I think it's even more likely than I did 15 minutes ago, and that is that you're going to have all sorts of pending litigation. And that's I think, slightly less of a nightmare, but it's not a sort of propitious scenario for this upcoming election. Second big question that I have as a political scientist is, how do these new electoral rules play out? And there have been a lot of really important changes over the past year, well, over past years, that are going to play out in the 2018 election. The first being no corporate contributions. I think this is no corporate contributions, and also much greater monitoring of caixadores, of illicit contributions. So that's kind of an interesting question, how that's going to change the way parties behave. There's a new performance threshold. It's a very low performance threshold, but it'll be interesting to see if that has any effect on which parties are participating, and some of the little parties that Fernando showed us there. But I think Fernando has it right when he says that the most important thing, I think, beyond next week's decision by the court, the next really big decision moment is what happens with coalition formation around this issue of airtime. How do the parties get airtime? And I think as we think back over the history of presidential elections in Brazil, this airtime can be very, very significant. So if you think about Ciro Gomes in 2002, you think about Marina Silva in the last election, both of them were destroyed by airtime. And so I think their prospects fell greatly. We shouldn't neglect the fact that the so-called fundo partidario, the public financing of this campaign, is enormous this time around, partly, I think, to compensate for the lack of corporate campaign contributions, but it's almost 2 billion reais. And so there's kind of a weird dynamic here where the coalitions are being pulled together on the basis of short-term interests, and you can imagine the kind of horse trading that's going to be happening there. What platforms are likely to emerge from this? What kind of coherent platforms are going to emerge from this? All right, so the third question, and I have a more certain answer now, I think, than I did when I began, and partly that's because I had the privilege of talking to Mauricio before the panel began. But my third question is, does an outsider emerge in this election? And, I always thought it was a little bit hard for that to occur. Mauricio, I think, if you don't mind my saying so, convinced me beforehand that it's even harder than I had originally thought. But if you think about it, right now, all of the leading candidates for president have either, well, think about a trifecta of three characteristics that you'd like in a presidential candidate. One is high approval, low rejection. Second is high name recognition, or the cash to build name recognition. The third is a clean coalition without corrupt actors in it, all right? And none of the candidates right now have that. And that's why you might think, well, an outsider could solve this problem. If you look at the current stable of candidates, the lowest rejection rate belongs to Lula. Lula has 54% rejection by comparison to Alckmin, who has 72% rejection. So, I think that this is very significant. The one outsider who has been in the news a lot recently, Luciano Huck, has 36% rejection, so half of Alckmin's level of rejection. But for a lot of reasons that we could discuss during the Q&A, and perhaps you should ask, I'll put Mauricio on the spot, I think that his candidacy and the candidacy of many outsiders is going to be very difficult, also because of what Fernando pointed out, which these coalitions really require some horse trading that somebody like Luciano Huck would have a really hard time to accomplish. The fourth question, and this is one that is maybe thinking 101 years out, but is one that I think is central to the whole drama of this year, is what sort of coalition is the winner of this election going to govern with? And as a consequence, what is the platform that this president is going to govern with? And when you look at the story of the last couple of months, the S&P downgrade, the Social Security reform, things are not going in a direction that seems very healthy. When we think about the history of the past 30 years, and we think about the fact that three parties have essentially been the crux of the political system over those past 30 years, I think that there are enough changes in the electoral system this time around, and there have been enough sort of conjunctural changes to the popularity of those parties, partly because of Lava Jato, that we may see this fall apart. Right? And so it's not that you're not going to have congressmen and congresswomen from those parties, but I think it's going to be a much less stable governing coalition than we've seen in the past. It's hard to predict whether there's going to be preservation of the old guard or whether there's going to be extraordinarily high turnover in Congress. But you could imagine arguments for both. And then when you think about how past presidents have governed, for example, Lula, it's hard to imagine how Lula is going to put together a coalition of the sort that he had when he was president. So how does he govern without the MDB? Lula is famous as a conciliator, but could Lula make peace with the MDB after what happened to Rousseff, just as a political question? And so as we're thinking about these coalitions, I think another interesting aspect is who are the vice presidential candidates and what are they attempting to signal? So what is the choice of a vice president and what does it signal for voters and then also about the general platform? Finally, the last question, this is my own study or my own research project, so I apologize if I'm bringing in parochial concerns, but I think that the concern going forward is how corrupt is this new Congress going to be? So we focused largely on the presidential campaign here, but I think that as we think about the legacy of the past 5 years in Brazil, 5 years going back to 2013, the turmoil that we've seen for half a decade in Brazil in both the economic and the political spheres, corruption has been at the core of it. And if you look at, I did an analysis of more or less 1,500 politicians who have served at the federal level since 2002. Of those 1,500 politicians, 423 are either under investigation or have been indicted. So 28% of politicians serving at any time over the past 16 years. You look at the Senate, 21 of the 54 senators who are up for re-election have been charged in Lava Jato. So this is a big question, and I think that while there may be turnover in the election, it's hard to know whether the right people are going to be turned over. Going to Mauricio's point, voters don't remember who they elected, and I think that this can be very significant, particularly because the pushback against anti-corruption efforts has deepened in recent months, and I think we've seen a number of ways in which if corrupt politicians or politicians who are part of the old system have seen the light at the end of the tunnel. They figured out how they can neuter future investigations and make it much harder to fight corruption. And so I think that this is potentially important consequences of this election. Unfortunately, I don't know how it'll turn out. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Matthew. Let's applaud. Any comments that you guys would like to make on each other's presentation, or I should go straight to questions? Well, Monica is anxiously awaiting to ask 1,000 questions. Please, Monica, pick your questions, ask 2 or 3 quickly, and then we continue. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. This was a very interesting and informative panel. I'll be brief, but I do have 3 questions. My first question is regarding the TV time issue and the perennial social media issues that we've been grappling with and thinking about in the context of Brazilian elections. Cell phone penetration in 2014 in Brazil or smartphone penetration was at around 20 to 25%. And since then, there's been an exponential rise in smartphone penetration in Brazil. It's now estimated to be above 65%. And that, I would like to hear your views as to how that affects or doesn't affect the TV time issue, given that a lot of candidates are already, and Bolsonaro is certainly one of them, doing a lot of videos on Twitter, on Facebook, and so on, and has a lot of followers on those two platforms. So that's my first question. Second question regards Lula, and I think at least my takeaway from the panel is that there's the chance that Lula will in fact be a candidate in the elections is much higher than him not being a candidate, which is certainly not the assumption under which markets in Brazil are working with. The assumptions that markets in Brazil seem to be working with is that everything's going to get resolved on January 24th. Lula's out. Everything's great. We're going to elect a centrist candidate. And then, you justify the recent rise in the Bovespa and everything else that's been going on in the country. Sounds like fantasy land to me. So I'd like to hear your take on that particular issue. And finally, with respect to the social movements, the new sort of civic movements that have arisen in Brazil in the past year or so, even longer, with a lot of these civic movements vying for congressional seats and really focused on the legislative elections as opposed to the presidential elections. So here I'm thinking of things like Renova Brasil and Movimento Agora and all of these other social movements. What are the chances that, and I guess this is directed mostly at you, Mauricio, but also at the others, what are the chances that we get some congressional renovation at least from these civic movements? So thank you very much.
Okay, Mauricio, questions number 1 and 3 seems to be directed to you.
First of all, working inside campaigns, the TV time is losing ground. In 2008, first campaign that I worked, we had a number that the audience for TV time was around 25-30%. Last year, in the highlight moment, we had 5-6% of audience in TV time. So TV time is losing a lot of ground in Brazil. And the spots, the 30-second spots, are much more important than the program, because people, first of all, they have internet connection, they have mobile, they have cable TV. So I think TV time is losing ground, and the mobile interactions are getting a lot of ground. And I have a hypothesis that a lot of political discussions are going to be held in the WhatsApp environment in Brazil. So because even the poor, they have WhatsApp, and they discuss politics in the WhatsApp. So and for some, but they are critical when from an inside campaign. Of course, they're going to fight for TV time because they are not only getting time, but also taking time away from the opposition. So it's a political battle, of course. And for Bolsonaro specifically, I think it's not a good deal for him to have more than 30 seconds to speak, because he doesn't have anything to say on 30. If I were running Bolsonaro campaign, I don't want him talking. So that's And Alckmin, on the other side, I think he needs a lot of time because he needs to present his case for the Brazil, not for São Paulo, but for the Brazil. About the movements, I have to separate the things. As a personal level, I wish those movements had get a lot of success, because we need people from outside politics and more technical approach on the Congress. But realistically, they're going to have a very hard time to elect people, especially in the South and the Southeast. I think they have a lot of more possibilities if they get good candidates in the North and the Northeast. But it's going to be very hard for especially because old school politicians are going to run for Congress. So we're going to have a lot of candidates for Congress coming from ex-governors, ex-senators, and they're not going to do 100 to 200,000 votes. They're going to have to fight for 50, 40,000 votes to get elected. So it's going to be very hard from those movements. But I wish, as on a personal level, they get successful.
Who can tackle the second question?
Lula and the fear markets? Go figure. I don't understand why markets have so much fear of Lula. Lula was the best president for them. Marcos Lisboa wrote that the most right-wing government in running the economy was first Lula administration. He was the one that was running. Yeah, well, but he's the one that is talking to the market all the time, right? So markets are irrational, and they don't know politics. They don't understand politics.
They have to make the money of the day.
So I don't understand that. And there's no need to understand that, because politics will go on without taking note of the market. The market may scream, but afterwards, the president will have to deal with the market. And Lula knows how to deal with the market. There's no problem for Lula to deal with the market. So I think this is not a real question. That's just daily basis. I would take a point with, I don't think that TV is not that important. TV keeps being important. The correlation between time of TV that each candidate, and I'm talking not only president, but all for governors also, it's straightforward. The larger time you have, the greater chance you have to be elected. So the two candidates that have the larger share of exposition on TV always get elected. This is kind of circular. You get more time because you are a stronger candidate. But that's produced by the political system. And voters can only vote in candidates that parties choose. You cannot vote in someone that is not in a ballot, right? So it may be the case that social media will revolutionize all this thing, that new techniques will emerge, but this takes time. And Brazilian politics and the Brazilian marketeers are used to TV and the way, and this is a different stuff. This is one-shot election. It's not as in here that you have a succession of primaries, and then after the primary, you go. So it's 45 days. It's not much more than that. So then you have to survive 45 days. And you need a lot of exposition. And TV and the spots grant you that. So I would say that this keeps being a factor. And besides, you have to have what they call palanques. You have to have the structure at each state to run a campaign. You cannot run a campaign isolated to presidency without having support for someone running for governorship in São Paulo. You have to have the match, because then you put together the two campaigns at the same time, and you have people working for you. So Bolsonaro has nothing of that. He will not have this. Who will run with Bolsonaro in São Paulo? Who will run with Bolsonaro in Minas Gerais? Who will run with Bolsonaro in Bahia? Maybe he has someone to run in Rio de Janeiro. Look how his son did for mayor in Rio de Janeiro. He did not survive. So politics, I said Brazil is not for amateurs. Well, politics is something that professionals know how to run. So going to these movements of renovation, they will end up with nothing. Politicians know how to do it. This is not something that I wish I would like to. This is something that has to have work, and certain type of work. Votes have to be produced, and there is a way of producing votes that these guys know how to do it. It's not something that you come up with from one day to another. So I'm much more cynical about that, maybe more pessimistic about the continuity of the system of these same guys that Matthew was talking about, they know how to run the business. They are pros. They control this stuff. So
And that is probably what makes also political reform so difficult.
Just two words on. Yes, I think Lula has a chance to be on the ballot after January 24. It's not the end of the story. Really, it's a confusing September month. That is when all the action will take place, and PT will have to take a decision, a risky decision, because if he doesn't change the candidate 20 days before, then he will have to be part of one of others coalitions. And you have Marina and you have Ciro, who will try to get the attention of the left in Brazil. So it will be a harsh decision. Technically, he has conditions of getting to the end. That's my understanding of the procedural of the criminal and the electoral battles. However, one interesting aspect is that perhaps he will be convicted more than once until September. Has other processes, there are 5, perhaps 2 or 3 will be decided criminally.
but
So,
not in the second tier. But not in
no,
the
no, no.
second-
There's. I'm not. Okay. I'm not talking about the legal repercussion of that, but the political repercussion, and then will be not just Moro. So, I don't know. This is backing to Mauricio and Fernando and Macho. What is the consequence? Will change anything? No. People who understand he is honest person will keep understanding that or not. But there will be this. And only regarding the old guard in Congress, you have also dozens of people pending their process before the Supreme Court. And we don't know how the Supreme Court will deal with that. Several of them, I think the charges are very strong and then they can be convicted. So this can shake a little bit some of the caciques of the strong parties. So this is, I think, something to take into consideration.
Well, Matthew, if you don't have anything to add, Peter, go ahead.
Let me ask 3 questions too, but short ones. One is, no one has sort of stated clearly, or you've shied away from it. What if Lula is on the ballot? What are his prospects of winning the election? It would be interesting just to get sort of an initial sort of assessment of that without going into it too deeply, because I know the many paths of this. Second is just a question for Fernando. You sort of contrasted, you don't need money in Brazil to win elections. You need to forge alliances. My question is, on what do you forge alliances? How do you sort of arrange alliances or buy alliances, if not with promises or money? And isn't money used, in fact, to forge alliances? So they tend to intersect. And third is just, Fernando, too, you dismissed the prospect of Bolsonaro because of the traditions of Brazil, the history. You know, those arguments were the same arguments we heard all during 2016 regarding Trump. Almost precisely the kind of argument you're using, that it's impossible for him to sort of overcome these enormously competent professional politicians with their statistics and their consultants, and he did.
So, Fernando, do you want to go first since 2 of the questions are directed to you?
Well, we have to think of Lula also thinking on the PT strategy, right? So for PT, there is no other way than having Lula in the ballot and to struggle to have Lula in the ballot. They will go up to the end, right? Because if they don't have Lula, they have nothing.
Mm-hmm.
They may change in the last minute, but they will go as far as they can with Lula.
Mm-hmm.
I think against the first intention of Lula. Lula did not want that. Lula would prefer to go to the sitio, to ranch, and run churrascos and soccer games.
Not for Atibaia, not
Yeah, not in Atibaia. But so Lula will be in the ballot. And Lula being in the ballot makes all the other actors to behave accordingly. We have to face Lula. What are the prospects of Lula? They are not that good. He's a weak candidate nowadays because of all this and because of all the problems PT had created to the country. That's why Maia said, I want him in the ballot. That's why Fernando Henrique is saying, I want him in the ballot. Everybody wants to fight him. It's easier for any party to have him in the ballot than to have open field. So he will be in the ballot, and there has to be someone that will be able to beat him. That's what the market wants. That's what people will pour money to. So the big question is, who will survive to face Lula? Lula will be there. He may not be there in the end in the sense that this decision will come, but this is 20 days before, and then they put someone else. But all the decisions are in April or July. April, the moment people have to get off of the government, so much earlier than that. So all the decisions have to be taken with Lula in the ballot. Everyone knows that. So that's why I'm saying bet on the maintenance of the duopoly. And the strongest candidate is Alckmin because he has more time on TV and he has more party support and everything else. Maybe Bolsonaro will be the third attempt. But I think that
can also be convicted by the Supreme Court.
yes,
He's on, for
what now?
For sexual harassment.
there's lots of
Yeah.
that's a lot of things against him. Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, finish it. I would just add that I also think that the PT has many fewer options today than it did in past elections. And part of that is the rhetoric of the PT boxing in the PT into certain alliances and certain arrangements. And you could also imagine, Oscar made the point about other convictions, which would hurt Lula's chances, and I think would hurt the PT's chances more broadly. As well as, I think that the PT is going to engage in a very meaningful public protest next week. And that may not have the effect that the PT, it plays to the PT base. It doesn't play to the popular election. And so I think that changes a little bit the calculus and makes Lula, sort of makes Fernando's point that Lula is a weaker candidate than he seems like at face value.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
I agree with the fact that if Lula goes all the way, it's going to be a referendum. Do you want a PT and Lula back or not? That's going to be the question. So that's going to... but I don't agree that Alckmin is going to have a very hard time for three reasons. First of all, PSDB doesn't help nationally. The branding PSDB doesn't help nationally today, especially with the Lava Jato connections. And he's going to have to spend the campaign explaining why his brother-in-law is in Lava Jato, why he was sitting in Lava Jato, what happened with Rodanel. It's going to be about that. It's going to be very tough for him. On top of that, the people, and I run this 1,000 times, it's very hard for PSDB to make the case outside São Paulo that they're going to put the poor as priority. And every time you run a survey about Alckmin in the north and the northeast, so this is a São Paulo guy with São Paulo agenda. It's very hard for him, and this affects his coalition base because no politician wants to take Alckmin to the countryside of the northeast. And third, all those things that's going to happen with Lula, if Lula becomes convicted many times, is going to make stronger the case for Bolsonaro. So so Bolsonaro is going to say, oh, you see how the Brazil works? The Lula is in the ballot, the judiciary system doesn't work, the people feel threat. So it's very hard for Alckmin.
But will be difficult for Bolsonaro to stand also the scrutiny, both judicial.
Yeah, but
he's already.
Who in the
Each interview
PSDB?
that he gives is a blow on his candidate.
Yeah, but the
He cannot speak.
but the
So as you
PSDB
said-
is
as
in
you
the
said-
center of Lava Jato. And they're
Well, and you said that Alckmin will have a hard time explaining his connection with Lava Jato. Who will ask him that? Lula?
no, but Bolsonaro.
So if
Let me-
he's
Bolsonaro-
facing Lula,
If you say Bolsonaro is
Bolsonaro cannot speak.
yeah, but
You said that.
he's
He
speak-
cannot
he's-
speak.
but he
So
has
he
one
cannot
basic-
ask.
he has one baseline speech. I'm
Well,
outside
but
Lava Jato.
Let us just go
But
to
he will
the,
be
to the
inside
facts.
Yeah.
many other
Who
things.
was the best candidate from PSDB in the first round since Fernando Henrique Cardoso? Who had the best electoral return in the first round since Fernando Henrique? Alckmin.
Alckmin.
But the
In
same candidate has
2-0-6.
less votes in the second round compared to the first round. That's
Well,
incredible.
what a problem! He had lost
And
already.
here you have the possibility of Lula not being on the second round, being in the first. So
And
it is.
Everything can happen.
let me remind you
right.
another thing. Contrary to what many people may think, journalists in Brazil are not just watching. There are already news regarding Mr. Bolsonaro. I talked recently with one of the most accomplished journalists in Brazil about Bolsonaro and said, wait until we run his prontuário,
Yeah,
his record.
will not survive.
It will not stand a minimal media examination. And,
no,
it's
It's
different.
different. It's different.
It is
It's
very
totally
different.
different.
Yeah,
I was
yeah.
trying to say that we do not have primaries.
yeah.
He can. Trump
And-
would win because he could face each adversary at a time and in very small electorates. He lost that general election, right? He won locally. Brazil is national. There we have one man, one vote. Not in here, right?
Yeah, and
That's
and-
why Trump is
and also,
capable of
I-
winning here.
I would like to add two things to this. First, he doesn't have the structure and the money that Trump had to compete inside the Republican. And once he got the Republican, then the party is structured. So he can get a party, but without funds, without television. Bolsonaro case.
That's not, that
Because
doesn't
he
mean
has-
support of the
He has
press.
a way to get in. Bolsonaro has antipathy of most of the large press. He doesn't have money. It's a completely different. and
Trump is
he-
a smart guy with
Yeah.
We do
leading
not,
with
And
the
also
media.
there is the thing that I
Bolsonaro
wanted
is
to
not.
say is that if Lula is
yeah, we don't have stable geniuses in
Yeah,
Brazil.
and
We
if
just
Lula-
have regular people running.
and if Lula is on the
That's-
ballot, Alckmin can do a very strong discourse on security. It's stealing from Bolsonaro also. He can speak to the right. São Paulo has is the most secure city among all the capitals.
Do you feel secure in São Paulo?
São Paulo is much more secure than Washington, D.C. in terms of homicides. So, this, just take the figures.
No, but that's
Well,
sensational.
let's.
So this will be, he will play the key of the right wing, and there will be no space for Bolsonaro. Anyway,
Well, I think we have basically covered the subject. We will continue to do this, although we are not going to be completely obsessed by campaign. We have other business to do that are other issues in Brazil that will be covered by this program, involving science, technology, environment, ecology, national security, by the way, very important. And so you will receive our notices. And but we will, when we have the opportunity, to bring you back to see how the electoral process is going, and we will have people, including from the new movements here. It's still 100 years ago, 100 years away, the election, but we will have plenty of chances of discussing this, and the impossible always happens in Brazil. Remember, it was impossible to tame inflation in Brazil until it was done. It's like, remember Mandela. It's always impossible until it happens. And so with that, I would like to thank you very much for being here, to continue to focus, to follow us here. And thank you very much, Mauricio, Fernando, Oscar, Matthew, for your contributions. They're very excellent panel. To our new intern, Audio Mesquita, who's there, a graduate from Berkeley University, from the great state of Goiás, and to our rock here, which is Ania Prusa. Nothing happens here until she tells me things will happen here. So thank you, Ania. Thank you, Audio. Thank you all for coming here. And we will adjourn now, but stay in touch. We will continue to be very active this year. Thanks. Vai cuidar do seu filho, meu filho. Da sua filha. Vai lá. Tá precisando trocar a fralda. Tá precisando trocar uma fralda lá.
Obrigado. Espero que... Bom, viu? I didn't put you on the spot.